the amateur practices until they get it right, and the professional practices until they can't get it wrong.
Joining me now, one of my favorite human beings on this entire planet, and a dude that exemplifies a growth mindset. He's all about work. He's all about passion. He's all about being the best you can possibly be. So much so that he made it his profession as a human performance coach, as a structural health specialist. He is making people better physically, emotionally, structurally, everything. So I love having him on. Great day, everyone. I'm Mike Pawlawski, former world champion quarterback, serial entrepreneur, and award-winning TV producer and host. I've lived a life dedicated to mastery through performance and mindset integration. Each week, I'll bring you the insights, strategies, and stories from some of the world's top performers to help you unlock your greatness. Whether you're an athlete aiming for the top or an executive driving your team to victory, this is where you learn how to train your greatness to become an everyday great. Now let's get after it. Ethan Banning, EB, welcome to the podcast.
Mike, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on with you. Yeah, we go down some serious rabbit holes, and I love to be able to provide some cool information and definitely the vocab word of the day too.
Yeah, I love it. That's one thing that we will get to later, because your vocabulary will grow today with Coach Banning on the show. He's awesome. So we're talking about the growth mindset today. You and I, when we played together, EB is a former teammate of mine, we used to talk through this stuff all the time. This is before Carol Dweck's work on mindset. This is before Angela Duckworth and grit. It was before all of these things became words and buzzwords, but it were the attitudes that we brought to it back then. So these things have been prevalent. They've existed before they've been documented and then, had studies done on them. But the mindset, growth versus fixed mindset. As an athlete, as a coach, how does that apply to athletes these days? And how do you use that information?
Well, I'll tell you how it started for me. So I'm very much an earn your spot type of human being. And to your point about the strength and conditioning and human performance, I've taken that into my life there. But I want to go back to where that started for me. So my dad is a retired special forces operator. All right. So And so now it's become very popular. Some of the folks out there that did those things, like Goggins is one of them, I believe. And there's some folks that have written some books. And then there was the Lone Survivor movie series, and then and some things like that. And I realized when I picked up some of those books and read the first opening chapter or so, I was like, I grew up this way. I lived this way. This is just expectations were set and met, and that was just part of our lifestyle. And I will tell you that it just became so natural for me to do that it was an obvious transition into human performance to help the skill sets that have been kind of grown inside of me and kind of pass those on. And when I look at that, I go, okay, how do we get one step better than yesterday? How do we get 1 inch better? And that's really what we're talking about, that growing or growth. I mean, it's really simple to me because I look at it and go, why do we lift weights? Because candidly, it hurts. It's painful, but
damage.
Yes, but it's an illustration or a metaphor for growth of any kind. It becomes uncomfortable. And what you just said was we damage the tissue at a microscopic level in a controlled manner, right? So at a reasonable risk reward ratio, and then the tissue grows back and we're subsequently stronger. And so the same thing's true when we're trying to work on, the emotional side, the spiritual side, the psychological side. We've got to get uncomfortable, right? And then we've got to, and we've got to grow. Now it's sort of counterintuitive though. And to your point, those topics weren't being discussed in where people were making money on them and writing books and so forth. There was plenty of information out there. It was pretty obvious that we had to hurt a little to grow, to become better. Me, at least, it always was. And so, and that kind of reverts back to that earn your spot. And it was always, I got such a great reward in my brain. I got dopamine dump when I got to see myself better. And I think that a lot of people do. In fact, I think that's how our biochemistry functions. I'm no expert in that, but I do have some decent understanding of it. And we've got to make sure we encapsulate athletes' why, because when you get to somebody's why, it becomes more powerful. And then it's meaningful. And once we get powerful and meaningful, then they can get to that reward center and get that dopamine dump and continue to challenge themselves. It's really dangerous or really challenging when you've got the athlete that's super gifted early on, the young man or young lady that hits puberty 2 years before everybody else and has all kinds of success in the junior sports game, and their work habits become subpar because they're like, well, I'm pretty good, I don't have to work hard. Right. And then all of a sudden that gap gets closed. And then it's like you're in that last 100 meters of the 400 and you came out too hot and you ran out of gas and they pass you. And if you don't ever recalibrate, then that athlete's going to be in trouble long term. And what I really try to do is, get connected with them, care about humans enough to understand their why, and help them to start reframe what their vision is, right? Because, that's really, encapsulates what we're talking about. How do we look at things from an aspect and make it to where I can be competitive and I get that reward? That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of frame it in easy terms for people at home, the growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Fixed mindset is all about your abilities, your assets. I'm smarter than anybody else. I'm faster than anybody else. I'm more athletic, right? Your identity is built around a fixed trait. And the concept of fixed is you don't get more, you don't get less. It's just, this is where it is. I have this amount of tools and that's it. Whereas the growth mindset is I'm not good enough yet. The only thing that stands between me and my eventual goal is a set of skills or a protocol or something else that I can learn or develop along the way. Which brings me to a great question, is that all athletes practice, right? All coaches believe in practice. People will tell you practice makes perfect, right? Vince Lombardi back in the day, who kind of was a mix of the fixed and the growth mindset in there. Don't you think kind of by nature that athletics puts people into a growth mindset?
Well, it can. I think we're taught to be the best liars in the world as humans. And then as athletes, it's even more so. I happen to know how your shoulder feels right now, but if you had an opportunity to play at Cal again or in the NFL again, and I said, hey, bud, I'm your quarterback's coach, I'm like, how's the shoulder feeling? You'd be like, what would you say?
All good.
Feels great.
Yeah, it's all good.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I dictate playing time, you know what the answer needs to be. Well, we can deceive ourselves too. And I got a great story about it. There's a young man named Nick Miller that I worked with from the time he was 17 years old. And Nick was a kid that played at Red Mountain High School in Mesa, Arizona, and had a lot of success. But he was an undersized guy, but he could really go a little bit. Had some twitch and some burst. And when he came to us in the junior college setting at Scottsdale Community College, he was fast. And he was one of the fastest guys in the program. Well, so we would do speed and strength development to help him run faster. He worked hard, but it wasn't purposeful and intentional because he was already fast. And I didn't have anybody that really scared him like, that person's faster than me, so I better. And I didn't notice it at first. I was earlier in my coaching career. And when we walk the whole story out, you'll understand. So he goes on and has some good success for us. And he's a good fast kid. He runs in the low 4.4s, right? So he's fast. He's real fast. And he goes on and plays at Southern Utah University, and he's the special teams player of the year. And he comes back and sees us to do his draft prep training for his NFL pro day and combine. And we had a class of athletes that came from other schools around the country that came into training. Now, all of a sudden, his purpose and intent changed.
Right. Because
he was like, I'm not the fastest kid in the group now.
Yeah.
But when his purpose and intent changed, because the potential was always there, like the dude had twitch. And so here's what I'll tell you. At the end of, he had a longer block of time to work with than most kids do because he didn't play at a Power 5 school. He played at a CS school. So he got out earlier And so he had more time to work with. But by the time he came to his pro day, he ran the fastest 40 and fastest short shuttle in the NFL that year. And he ran 4:25 in the 40,
right,
3:96 in the short shuttle. And that was at BYU's pro day. And it really came down to, he understood he was being challenged. He was the underdog because he was from a smaller school. He didn't have great size, but some skill sets he did have that he could optimize were his linear speed and his lateral ability to change directions. And he really stepped in with purpose and intensity and intentionality and got incredible improvement during that training process. But he changed in here. And that was the thing. So then looking back, I went, he practiced hard before, but it just wasn't the same. There was this switch that flipped. It's sort of like this Stallone movie from back in the day where he turns the hat over the top and he flips the switch. I know we're aging us here, but
all of a sudden, Eye of the Tiger comes on, the workout starts.
But he earned his spot. So consequently, who signed him? The Raiders did, because they love speed. Right? So they signed the fastest guy, and he had a chance to play a few years in the NFL. And it was an incredible story. But he figured out, even though he was faster than his high school teammates, and he was as fast as all of his junior college teammates, and he went and played FCS, and he was one of the fastest kids on the team. But then he came back, and he knew he had to compete at the next level. And so that challenge was then set in front of him, so that every day working against people that were as good or better challenged him, and he could press into that. And so it caused him to then reframe how he looked at things so that he continued to be able to compete and get that dopamine dumped into his brain, and ultimately landed him in the NFL. And it's a great way to, it's a great story that illustrates, having grit and overcoming, bad habits or maybe less than work habits and building them into great work habits.
Yeah, it kind of illustrates having to reframe your mindset, because that's the key there, right? You go in thinking, I'm fast, period, I'm fast. And you don't work on I'm fast. You don't put the effort into I'm fast, because I already got that. I'm good. I'm fixed, right? I'm in that position, until all of a sudden things change for you. And this is why I think athletics is to some extent a great developer of growth mindset, because we all of a sudden realize where we're weak once it shows up. And most athletes, now I've played with some guys who never put in the work, who never got there, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But the ability to recognize, hey, oh, wait a second, these guys are as fast as I am. Or in my case, these quarterbacks can throw as well as I can, or they can do the things. What's going to differentiate my game? Is it mental? Is it physical? Is it toughness? Is it whatever it may be? And I need to develop that. I'm not good enough yet. And now how do I build that out? So I think athletics to some extent helps us develop that growth mindset, because there is a built-in failure all the time. You are expected to fail the first time you pick something up. Like, I go out and throw an out route the first time in college, and I've got a dude running a 4.3 out there, and I've got linemen in there, and I don't hit it. I'm not on time. Things are wrong. So that's a failure. And then you have to take that failure and say, okay, how do I get better? Where's my foot placement? How do I quicken my drop? And all these things you need to improve. And so I think in athletics, in sport, you're faced with failure all the time, and overcoming that failure, knowing you can get better just as soon as you develop that skill. I think that's the way you develop that growth mindset in sport.
Indeed. I mean, we look at it and go, that's just a feedback loop to your brain, right? And so, most athletes are competitive. The ones that achieve really highly, I think, are ultimately, very competitive. And that feedback loop of that doesn't feel very good. It's the pain. I mean, we got a pleasure center and a pain center, and not throwing it on time or on the money makes you have embarrassment. It's emotional embarrassment at that point. And it's either you make a decision that I'm better than that, and you go back and hone your craft and work at it, or you don't. But if you don't, you're sort of quitting. Even if you're just out there participating, that's not winning. So
right.
But that's growing.
And that's the point there too. This is the point that always fascinates me is I'm better than that is a kind of a fixed mindset. I'm better. I'm physically, I'm better. Right. you have to have a little bit of the fixed mindset to have that embarrassment, right? To have a little bit of that ego bruise, yet you have to have enough of the growth mindset that you can say, okay, that bruised my ego, but I can get better. I can improve performance. And so where is the magical mix on that?
Yeah, that's that $64,000 question, right? I mean, I am better also says to me, I'm better than that says I can do it better, right? And being this constant tinkerer, that, you know, your own mechanic, if you will, to work on the intricacies of your game so that you ultimately continue to get better, right? Because, I mean, to your point, when you first go to Cal, as an example, you know, like a year before, you don't have kids that are, you know, hitting that route in the same space, same place. I mean, you're one of the bigger guys on the field in high school, more than likely. I mean, certainly stronger guys on the field. All of a sudden you go to Cal and it's like, there's some big, strong dudes here.
Well, so just like that, you know, when we talk about when I came in, I was small at Cal. I was huge in high school, right? 6'2", 195 or close to 6'2", 195. I was close to the fastest guy on the field, and I thought of myself as this great athlete. But then coming into Cal, all of a sudden I realized, I don't know if I can play here. So a different animal, I have to put in the work to play there. What about dudes who are so gifted, so athletic, just natural genetic lottery winners? And we've seen them, that they can not do the work and run 4.3. Does not having to do the work make you emotionally softer, right? This is that fixed mindset. This is that I'm so talented, I just roll my helmet on the field and play, and that's it. Does that make you softer as an athlete?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, you know, we generally see it at the younger ages, but we've seen athletes like that over the years that, you know, have seemingly been able to do it, and then their career or maybe shortened, or sometimes they figure it out. You know, ultimately for me, and the way I try to address that, and what I believe to be the secret sauce, is getting to their why. Right. So, you know, when I think of that or look at that, I think, well, how do I get into their soul? So, and a guy comes to mind. I worked with a guy named Simeon Rice several years back, and Sim was, you know, at the time he was like a 5-time All-Pro. He'd been like defensive rookie of the year. He was, you know, like maybe second fastest to 100 sacks in NFL history. He'd done some different things. He'd won a Super Bowl, you know, so I was on the latter half of his career. And we were sitting down talking about goals. And Sim was notorious for being like a Jerry Rice, Walter Payton type of worker, like outworked everybody. He'd get 3 or 4 training partners and just go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And
one guy alone couldn't keep up with him.
Yeah, he was just a lactic threshold monster. And I remember, you know, getting to his why, and he really was always pushing to be more and setting the bar a little bit higher. Like, oh, had 12 sacks last year, let's get 15, or let's this. And so being, you know, going to the Pro Bowl no longer was getting that dopamine center in the same way. His sights were set more on like defensive MVP of the league, you know, but you've got to really dig deep and find what drives somebody, and they have to participate in it too. And that's the really big piece. You know, if they're not willing to participate in it, it's like taking somebody that's overweight that I'm trying to help their fitness journey, and I give them an eating plan. And 6 weeks later, they tell me they're eating exactly the way I say, but they don't look any different. They're lying.
Right.
They're lying to themselves and they're lying to me. And like, as an athlete, there's got to be somebody that we can be authentic with, and we have to be authentic with ourselves. And then hopefully there's some accountability person or people in your life that you can be authentic with too, so that you can go, okay, I gotta set my goals higher, because if you do hit that, you know, proverbial, you know, genetic lottery, then what do you do with it? Like, and my dear friend Dan O'Brien has a great story about that. So Dan ultimately is an Olympic gold medalist. He owned multiple world records. He's won multiple world championships, you know, tons of U.S. championships.
In the decathlon, which is considered the world's greatest athlete.
Yes. But that story could have ended really ugly with none of those things happening. So, like, So he's got I failed out of college, right? Story. And he was ranked number one in the world going into 1992 at the Olympic trials. He doesn't make a height in the pole vault and doesn't even make an Olympic team.
Right. And for those who remember the time, this is when Reebok was doing the big campaign about Dan and Dave. We're talking about Dan here, Dan O'Brien. So it was a very public, very big story.
Yeah, it was very embarrassing. I believe it was the biggest ad campaign to that point in history. It was Visa and Reebok did Dan versus Dave. They were ranked Dan was ranked number one in the world. Dave was 2 or 3, I don't know. And it was this competitive thing. Ultimately, Dan had a whole bunch of circumstances that led to it, but he ended up not getting a height in the pole vault. He didn't make his opening height. And so you don't get a score for that event of the 10 events, and you're not going to
can't miss a score in one event and make it the decathlon.
No. So at that point, we've had very poignant conversations about this privately over the years. After he got through the feel sorry for himself and the rough part of that, because there was plenty of that, this happened on a international stage of television. Then I don't think he lost another decathlon after that ever. Like he made a commitment to himself in the mirror that was like, it was this step and that was just huge. And I'll tell you, he went on to set the world record later that same year.
Yeah, that summer. Right?
In Talents, France. It's the event that just happened, I think, like a couple weeks ago, within the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think it happened in September. I think that's when it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was this, to your point earlier, this eye of the tiger that just came upon him. And from that point forward, it was the thing. But like in that failure, honestly, I've asked him this question. I go, do you think, if you didn't fail there, do you definitely set the world record and do you definitely win a gold medal? He's like, that's a great question. I don't know. And I believe that setback set him up ultimately for that huge success. Now, we're never going to know.
Right.
So we'll just say I'm right because.
Yeah. There's nothing to compare it to, right? There's no control group in that experiment. So it's really hard to tell.
But in light of your question, though, he hit the genetic lottery, right? Like he's genetically very gifted.
Clearly, if you're setting world records, and you're the world champion and Olympic gold medalist, you've got some genetic potential.
But even with that, he had failure. And that failure, he got punched in the face. And I have a saying, the best way to learn how to duck, get punched in the face.
Yes.
And in life, kicked him pretty good, punched him pretty good. And he then really went back to work. He really felt that pain. And so, and sometimes that's the way it has to happen with those elite, like genetically gifted folks. I mean, I think if you look at everybody's long-term success story, nearly everyone is going to have that moment where they got punched.
Yeah.
Now, what we do with that is sort of what defines us. Everybody's going to get knocked down, right? There's famous cliche. Why are they cliche? Like, because it's true. Yeah. Do you get up? Knock down, keep getting up. And so if you keep getting up, ultimately, you're going to have some success.
Yeah.
And certainly if you're genetically gifted.
Sure. A couple things going for Dan there. I mean, studies have shown, that when you have that kind of struggle, that kind of problem, seeking help, finding a coach or a mentor or somebody at that point to help you through that is a big piece of it. Obviously, Dan had a coach that he loved at the time and kind of working with him, right? Finding coaching to help you improve. But B, that it just illustrates the growth versus the fixed mindset. If Dan had the fixed mindset, and think about how many times Dan O'Brien had been told how great he is by that time, right? People told him how wonderful, how incredible, the most amazing athlete, all these things. And if he takes that to heart, but Carol Dweck's studies had shown, and hers were about innate intelligence, right? The beliefs on innate intelligence. But I think it applies to everything. It's that if you have that fixed mindset, I am this smart, then what you do is when you face a challenge, you shrink from it because you never want to subjugate your ego to being less than your identity in your head. So if I think I'm super smart and they say, you want to try this physics test, which is like Brainiac Plus, or this 7th grade test, you tend to defer for the 7th grade test because you want to prove how smart you are rather than being exposed as potentially not smart because the test is threatening. If Dan has a fixed mindset at that point, he falls back and he says, I need to protect my ego. But instead, he comes out with the growth mindset and says, I need to improve. I'm just not there yet. And I think part of that, by the way, to his beneficial thing is that was really the only way forward for Dan at that point too, was to come back and prove what you can do.
I think so.
Yeah. And so that's a big piece of it too, right?
You said something there that made me think about, interestingly, so I work a lot with teenage athletes now. I've been called to that. I worked with pros for a long time, and teenage boys have this tendency to want to come in and show me how good they are.
Every time.
And prove themselves.
Every single session.
And it's a psychology thing. It's well established. It's what it is. And I think one of the takeaways here today that I'd love for people to take away from this podcast is identify experts in your life that can help you achieve your goals, and then let them be your expert, right? So we'll have a kid come in or a young man come in and, try to prove to me how great they are. And I'm just like, well, I mean, you're great for a 15-year-old high school kid, but I, as a fat old guy, can still run circles around you and outlift you and do all these things. So slow down. Let's learn something here. And those kids that grasp onto that and see that the wisdom that I have and other coaches have that can help, drive them in the direction, I can give them, step-by-step instructions of how to drive their proverbial car, to the finish line, if they'll allow it, right? So it's a really interesting concept in that sometimes, I mean, and early on in training for me, I'll make that athlete that wants to show me how great they are. We'll have the conversation verbally, like, hey, why are you here? What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to show me how great you are and how much you know, or do you want some of the information that I have and the growth that I can provide? And a lot of times that's just not uncomfortable enough for them to move, for us to move the needle, right? So then some puking or something usually has to happen. Some humility feeder has to happen for them to go, oh, okay, maybe I don't know quite as much as I thought I knew. And then we start to grow. But I mean, I contend that pain is a wonderful teacher. And so, learn a lesson.
Without a doubt, and open yourself up to, you're not all that. That's a big piece of it. I can get better. I absolutely can get better, but I'm not there yet. And then I think putting that fixed ceiling on us, oh, we're good. We're really good. Well, if you're really good, then why are you here?
Yeah.
We're trying to get better. We're trying to improve every single day. You talked about your dad's background as a special forces, in the special forces, and I always screw this up. My buddies who are teams guys tell me I'm saying it wrong. So whatever that may be, apologies to anybody if I'm offending you on that. But part of that with those guys is they are grinding all the time, doing their thing, right? Getting better, improving the toughness. But what they do is they set, when it gets really, really hard, and I remember doing this as an athlete when I was conditioning and lifting and working out, is they set a horizon, which that's their goal. I'm going to reach this horizon, right? And once I reach this horizon, then I'm going to reset horizons, and I'm going to move, and I'm going to move, and I'm keep moving, even though it's difficult, right? You're in that hard struggle. You hear about it in these harrowing stories, Lone Survivor being one of them with Luttrell, and these guys who get through these things, they set the horizon, they reach the horizon, they reset the horizon. And part of that is the reward you get for reaching that horizon. You've talked about dopamine. It's a great reward to us when we accomplish a goal, but it's also a motivator in that as soon as we go into that dip where dopamine goes away, now we want it again. We want to get that dopamine back, and so getting that back is a motivator for us as well. The ability to reset horizons for athletes, and as a coach, especially with you have to do that by developing a process, right? You're on an 8-week lifting process or a 4-week lifting process or whatever that may be. how do you get athletes to forego this? Nowadays, everybody wants to be on Instagram. The splash of that big dopamine draw of me being out there, and think about, I'm going to give up what I want, not give up, but I'm going to leave that what I want out there. And I don't want to give that up for what I want right now. Right now, I need to do this little piece of work to get to that eventually, rather than I want this big dopamine splash right now. How do you get them into the process? That was a long-worded question, so long ways around it. But how do you get them into the process and out of the showmanship of it?
Well, I mean, you get me hyped a little bit talking about some of that, but I'll answer the question first and tell a little story. But so I believe strongly that the trophies are not won on game day. The trophies are won in preparation, practice, weight room, in the suffering, in
Yes.
what they call embracing the suck, right?
Yeah.
That's where, in helping these athletes understand, like, yeah, it's great to get likes or it's great to be seen, but I'd rather suffer in private and succeed on the stage of the event. One thing I know that's really rewarding is winning. And, and so talking about staying in the process for them is a really critical piece of it. And so you bring up probably my favorite line and scene and just whole, like, kind of event from a movie, when Marcus Luttrell tells the story about draw a line, right? So for 7 miles with multiple fractures, spine, femur, like, dude been shot, only person alive. He reached out as far as he could and he would draw a line in the dirt, and his goal was that line. And so continuing to draw a line for our athletes and setting something out there for them to have success is the constant challenge. And that becomes relational, right? They have to respect their coach. And this is the same thing for me. I needed to respect my coach or the person that was mentoring me in a way that we created relationship and we could come together and set a new standard each time. Expectation. What can we do to be a little bit better each day? So ultimately, because when I look at it, it's periodization and programming, or periodization, or whatever term they're coining it these days. It's ultimately finishing with, like, as an example, a high school football player would be the state championship game, would be the pinnacle of it, winning that. And so we look at that, and we look at that date and what we're trying to achieve, and we'll work backward from that to say January 1st or whenever it is in January. What do we need to be doing on January 13th so that we're succeeding on December 4th? And each day it has to build in, and it would be wonderful if that line between January 13th and December 4th was straight. But if we look at it over time, it's not a straight line, but it needs to be a trajectory, a slope that continues in that general vicinity. Like, if we start here on January 13th, we don't want to dip way below that. We may have a go up, and by March we're here, but we may have a dip in it, but we didn't dip all the way back here. And so ultimately continuing to get just that little bit better than we were so that we achieve our goal. And that's the long-term goal, maybe, or a midterm goal, that December 4th goal. We've got another life goal that's out there. And then we got a shorter-term goal, to your point, that 4 or 8 week goal that we look at and go, okay, what's the carrot that I can dangle out in front of them? Or the stick that we can smack them with a little bit that it's painful if we don't do this thing. And so that ultimately we can continue to get a little bit better. I've met a lot of people that want to lift a whole lot. Let's say I want to bench press 1,000. Well, it's going to take a lot.
That'd be a little bit of weight.
Want to. Yeah. But it's going to take a lot more than want to and just walking into the gym. Like, lots of people can walk in the gym. Lots of people are going to want to do something. We got to take action. Once we take, like, purpose-filled, intentional action with a very specific goal, then we've got something. That's magic in a bottle.
Yeah, and it's what that it's a little bit of action today, right? Like, we talk about taking massive action. You have to take massive action for sure, but it's a little bit of action today. I need to reach this line today. I need to get my 4 sets of whatever, and I need to get a little bit of improvement in whatever other marker I need to hit and kind of do those every single day. I needed to give maximum effort on X, Y, and Z today, whatever that is. A huge piece of that, I think, is that especially young athletes, I coach them all the time, don't have a lot of sense of temporal awareness, right? They're not, we look back now that we're former players and we look back to when we were playing and think, man, if I only knew now what I knew then, right? I didn't know who I was going to be, at 40, at 50. I didn't know any of that when I was playing. And so we visualize ourselves as that person at that age going forward. And events change, life circumstances change, relationships change, training change, like everything changes. And so being able to have this relationship with your future self, feel accountable to your future self, is a huge piece of that, in my opinion. There was a great study about it done on finances. And would you do more for retirement now if you got to know yourself, if you had a better relationship with your future self? And they found out that when people started thinking about that future self, their saving became better, their retirement planning became better, everything became better, and they didn't see it as suffering. It's the same idea for an athlete. If you get this great relationship with your future self, if you can visualize yourself as this future self, and this to me, I'm a fan of the law of attraction, but I think it's half absolutely right on and half absolute bullshit, because the half of it where you've got to think about it, you've got to see yourself as that, you've got to practice it, you've got to repeat it to yourself, you've got to get this positive imagery to yourself or in your head and think about it, that it's absolutely essential for success. But then the universe doesn't just give it to you. It's as a result of developing my identity with those stories that I put in the work that then gets me to my goal. It's not just, hey, the universe has given it to you, but the people who get there kind of forget the hard work that goes along with the law of attraction too. So anyway, once again, long question because I'm thinking out loud, but the ability to get an athlete to think about themselves long-term as a coach is absolutely key. How do you help develop an athlete's appreciation for that incremental improvement? It's going to help them get to that long-term self.
Well, one of my favorite quotes regarding that is, if you want to be taken seriously, be consistent. And that it's really powerful when we really think about it. I think that teenage athletes and people in general, but teenage athletes grossly overvalue how much they can get done in one day, that massive action. They incredibly undervalue how much they can get done in a year with consistent action.
Yes.
Right. So if you're building success, that consistency and small, you stimulate the body, and then you actually settle in and you become that result, rather than just instead of trying to go from lifting a 10-pound dumbbell to a 100-pound dumbbell, as an example, in my profession, we'd go to a 10 to a 15, and then we'd go a 15 to a 20. And we take incremental, outcomes, and we do it over and over again. I really, to me, doing things with excellence is boring to some degree, because we just have to do the ordinary thing extra, and we have to do it with purpose and intent, so that it becomes not until, and you've heard me say this before, the amateur practices until they get it right, and the professional practices until they can't get it wrong. And we do the ordinary thing over and over and over and over and over and over again until we do it with excellence every time. And it creates, so that consistency in practice creates that consistency and outcome of that thing. And that's really, I think that ultimately, and I talked about this earlier, getting to someone's why and helping identify what drives them, what motivates them. Most times it's not really lifting that 10 more pounds. It's how lifting that 10 more pounds or jumping that vertical jump higher, how does that help you ultimately on the playing surface perform with excellence and win championships? So we can,
All right, go ahead.
No, well, that's really how we get there, and if somebody isn't motivated by winning championships, it gets tougher.
Yeah. And when you talk about their why, how does that why now tie back into all these little things, the incremental steps that you have to take, the incremental steps that you have to make. I use the same quotes. I stole your quote, or I stole it from you. It's not your quote originally, but the amateur practices until they get it right, and the pro practices until they can't get it wrong. It's a fantastic quote. The other one is never get bored of the basics, right? We do the basics. I teach quarterbacks. We do drops every single time. Drops on the line. We're honing our drops. We're doing this. And I liken it to sanding wood, because when you start off with wood, you start off with this coarse sandpaper. And so when you first start, it makes huge changes, and you can get the rough edges off right away, and you can get it a little bit smoother. It's going to look a little bit cleaner from far off. But then when you move in, now it's still got to let the grain to it from the big sandpaper, right? From the grooves in the sandpaper. And so it's still pretty rough, and it's still not where you want it to be, and it's not polished by any means. So you take another finer grit of sandpaper and you start polishing again. And you can literally go all the way down that grit scale of sandpaper, from starting at 60 grit, getting into the thousands, till it's so fine and so polished on wood that you don't even need lacquer or any kind of finish to make it shine, because you've honed off all the rough edges. And once you've gotten to that granularity of the sandpaper that you can't even tell the difference between a finished product with lacquer or some kind of outside sealant and just regular wood, now you've gotten past those rough edges to where the pro needs to be.
Well, and it's interesting, and back to the kind of the Instagram or social media comment and tying that in, I see a lot of folks out there that liken themselves to experts and doing things well, and they're the guru and so forth. And I am looking for mastery, right? Not excellence, or not expertise. See, to me, expertise is the ability to explain a complex subject in complex terms. But mastery is the ability to explain a complex subject in simple, easy to understand terms. We need more masters and less experts.
Yeah, that's actually a great quote. I listen to people sometimes. Again, you and I have been doing this since we played together way back when. To date us, that would be about almost 3 decades ago. Like really close. It was a while ago. So, and we were doing these things back then. We didn't have the terminology for it. We didn't have the experts back then teaching us.
Yeah.
We had our beliefs, and I was lucky. You were raised in it. I was raised by a paratrooper, I was raised by a paratrooper who was a phenomenal human being and a really tough guy at the same time. So he was the sweetest dude in the world, but he was also tough in the sense that he had been there and done those things and knew what it took to do those things. And so when it came to athletics, when it came to things, there was no quit. I remember "I can't" was like saying the worst cuss word you could possibly drop in the middle of a conversation with my dad. "I can't" was not an acceptable thing. And that's when he would lose it. "I can't" means "I won't, Michael. Let's go. That's it." Like, he would be on me about it. And so I love that about him. Part of what he taught me in those circumstances, those instances too, is dealing with stress. Because and we'll kind of finish on this phase. I've recently gotten these studies by Dr. Leah Crum, who was at Stanford. So as a Cal guy, I'm not supposed to appreciate that word, but I appreciate the work. And she deals with what she calls the stress is enhancing mindset. And it's as we get the stress response in our body, we have all felt it, right? It's the little bit of anxiety. It's that visual narrowing. It's the shallowness of breath. It's the palpitations maybe, or light sweat on the skin, the tremor in your voice, all of those things that are stress responses for the human animal. And they found that teaching people that stress is adaptive, that those responses are adaptive and can help you perform better, will literally help you perform better, as opposed to people who are taught that those stress responses are negative. And we've had so much negativity in terms of stress in our world, right? We're always trying to reduce stress, get rid of stress, and it's become this negative word. But for an athlete, stress is a phenomenal thing because it does heighten our ability to perform under pressure. And I remember when I learned that, I was at Cal. We had a psychologist there by the name of Bill Koish, and it used to piss me off that I would yawn before every game. Back there yawning, tired, and I'm like, why am I yawning? Like, am I not prepped for this? What's my deal? And I talked to him, he's like, oh no, that's fight or flight. That's your body getting ready to go. Your body wants to go. It's getting more oxygen in the system. Here's what's going on. All these physiological responses. And I was like, that's awesome. So it's like a performance enhancing drug and I'm giving it to myself. Like, let's do this. I love that. And taking that approach to it completely changed the way I approach games and stressful situations in life. Being able to put that together with that growth mindset of I'm not there yet, as long as I do the work, is a special ability for athletes, like to be able to combine those two, that synergy between those two. So talk about how you work with athletes to teach them about the stress response, how they can use that to their benefit, and talk about how you can potentially tie those two together.
Well, it sounds like you did a really great job of reframing your mindset.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you look at that. And so I always find it interesting. I hear these quote experts again talking about we got to reduce stress. And I just like, and then I look at it and go, well, everything that I do professionally is inducing stress. The whole point, I'm making the body uncomfortable so that then it makes a response so that it grows back stronger. That just doesn't match. And then I saw this TED talk and this gal discusses, one of the longest studies that's ever been done. Harvard did this, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
It's a study that's over 75 years. It talked about, they had people assess how they evaluate stress. And they asked a few questions, and I don't remember it by heart, but I'll do my best. But they, asked how much stress do you have in your life? Do you think stress is bad or good? And they got different responses from different people. And what they found was it didn't matter if you felt like you had stress in your life of a 2 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. That wasn't the factor. And when I say a 75-year study, they went until people died.
Yeah.
Right. And,
yep.
And they were testing to see someone with high stress in their life die earlier or later, or what was the needle mover. What they found was the person that said stress is bad for me, scale 1 to 10 on an 8 versus so stress is a motivator for me is a 2 out of 10. Stress is not bad for me. The people that viewed stress as a motivator, the people that viewed stress as healthy, the way that you changed your mindset, I'm preparing. That's my nervous system getting me ready. I'm working out, lifting weights so that I damage my muscles so that it grows back stronger. That's stress. So those folks that viewed stress as a benefit, not a hindrance, lived much longer, not some longer. Even if they had stress 9 out of 10 in their life, if they viewed it as a benefit, it was a life extender. And it's a really cool thing. So I talk to them about like, hey, I really bring things back down to when we're talking about psych issues, we're talking whatever issue it is. How do you think you go from being able to bench press the bar to being able to bench press, 95 pounds to 135 pounds? Well, because damage is done, the body then cyclically, we damage the body, it comes down like this, and then it builds back up through repair, and we become stronger. That muscle becomes more dense, it becomes bigger, it becomes stronger. So then you can lift that new weight. And it's really because our body wants to stay in a process called homeostasis. So if we do something that challenges it and gets it out of its comfort zone, it makes an adaptation to then become better at that task so that it's more comfortable. So then we have to do what? Create a stress environment so that it grows again. I mean, it's simple. It's the same thing that they're arguing against is in reality what we should be arguing for.
Yes.
And it's an anxiety thing too. So it's called exposure therapy. If somebody has anxiety around people and then they go become a hermit, they're like, oh, my anxiety is lower, so therefore the problem must be people. And it's like, no, you're lowering your exposure, so therefore you lower your ability to deal with it. And I think a great illustration for that is the sun. If I'm out in the sun all summer on a small dose relationship and grow into that, I don't get sunburnt by the end of the summer because my skin has changed and it now tolerates more sun exposure. But if I go become a hermit and hang out inside for 6 or 10 months and go out in the sun for 3 hours, it's not going to be very favorable for my skin. And the same thing's true from an anxiety perspective, from a weightlifting perspective, I think from any growth perspective in our lives. And so I articulate some of those different illustrations for our athletes and they go, boom, light bulb clicks on like it did for you. And they get it and they go, okay, I just need to get a little bit better today.
And that is so huge. That gives you control. I think oftentimes that's what I think these all, quite honestly, personally, if I'm going to boil it down to one word for everything we've talked about, is control. As an athlete, are you in control of your future? Because you decide whether to put in the work. You decide whether you can get better or not. You decide whether you look at stress as painful or profitable in terms of the way that you handle it mentally. Then that is how you grow. That is how you control your environment. And the human animal is always looking for control. In everything we do, we are emotionally looking for control. I think these things give an athlete control over their performance.
Well, I mean, there are things that we can control. We're not all gifted the genetic, lottery, but there are things within our control. Like we can't control how tall we're going to be or, the gifts that we have, but we can control, being the hardest worker in the room, showing up early, staying late, eating better, getting more sleep, doing the things that we can control are where really the takeaway is here. To your point on control, like there are only so many factors that we can control. Making sure we take control of those, take the reins, take control of your career and drive, ride that horse in the direction you want to go.